Hi, my name is Ami Jaeger, and I am so happy to be here with you today and to be part of the Dementia Possibilities Conference. I want to thank Utah and the whole team that spent a lot of time and creative effort to put together this conference and to be so adaptable to be able to do the conference remotely. I mean, that is quite a task. So even though I am really going to miss seeing all your beautiful faces and seeing your reactions and getting feedback from you during this presentation, I'm going to do the best I can and just kind of provide the information. And my contact information is part of the program and will be available for you to send me an email or give me a phone call with any follow-up questions. So let me tell you a little bit about myself and then we'll jump right in because today what we're going to be talking about is what kind of documents can we put together that's going to support our personal choices and our personal decisions about how we want to live our life when we might need a little bit of help that we didn't used to need for a variety of reasons. So my name's Amy, as I said, I'm an attorney here in Santa Fe, and I very much enjoy working with clients that are experiencing dementia and living with dementia and their caregivers and their families to help put together a plan that will guide the path of the person living with dementia and their family, that will respect their autonomy and dignity and really address some of their fears and concerns as they go through life, and frankly as we all go through life and think about putting together what is our life plan. Today is Monday, February 8th when I'm recording this, and it's the day after the Super Bowl. And regardless of the teams that you rooted for, it is pretty amazing to me that some of the headline stories about the Super Bowl was that it was won by the team with the oldest coach and the oldest quarterback. So I think there's a lot of strength and a lot of reason to celebrate our wisdom and experience and achievement that we have earned throughout our life. And to be able to apply this to our next daunting task, which is how do we choose to live our life fully? And how do we plan the next phase of our life? I like to think about this really in the context of a book that I read that really inspired me. It's called The Life Cycle Completed by Erik Erikson. But what is so interesting about this is the edition that was completed by his wife after Erik died. And the reason why I am so kind of inspired about this and think about this as really a framework for how I approach working with my clients and really how I approached caregiving for both my parents who passed away in their late 90s. And my father lived with vascular dementia for about 10 years. And the burden that that had on my mother and my family in providing care for him, providing care for my mom, and help them to be fully engaged in their 80s and in their 90s. So Erik Erikson is a psychologist, and he put together really the psychological developmental phases of our life. And he starts with infancy, early childhood, play age, as he calls it, school age, adolescence, young adulthood, and adulthood. And in his book, he describes each of these phases as developmental steps that we experience or we go through as part of our achieving personhood throughout our life. But after he passed away, as I had mentioned, after his wife had taken care of him in his older age, she went back and looked at this and she added a ninth phase in which she calls old age. And she added this in thinking about what does it mean as we age and what is the psychological milestones that we encounter at this phase of our life. She talks about it and describes it as integrity versus despair. Can we face the issues that we're facing, many times health, infirmity, cognitive infirmity, without lapsing into despair, and to think about it as how we integrate this experience as part of our entire life. She reflects on the wisdom that's reflected in this age of life, and she talks about legacy. She also says one of the negative psychological aspects can be disdain. In other words, we've kind of heard it all and been through it all, and honey, you really don't understand what I'm going through. So those are the sorts of the things that we need to think about and say, is this really serving us? So I like thinking about this because in Eric and his wife's book, they describe it as the ninth life cycle. So I like thinking about this as life phase 9. So here we are, life phase 9, that it's a time for us to embrace wisdom and thinking about this as a developmental task. And how can we support our life and our choices at this point in life phase 9? So let's talk a little bit about that. I think it's so important, instead of just giving up, as Erickson describes, and just falling into despair, and saying, how can I embrace where I am, knowing what I know, and what's the process for me to do it? And that's where I come in. I hope to be able to provide you with the legal tools to put together a series of documents that accurately reflect what your choices are and how you would like to be treated in this phase of your life. Instead of just saying, okay, this is the end of my life and I'm just sort of going to let things happen to me and not make choices. Because I admit these are hard choices to make. They're hard things to think about. But I would like to encourage you, just as when you became a parent for the first time, a huge developmental milestone, a huge part of people's identity to go from being a spouse to being a parent, and all the responsibilities, challenges, joy that parenting brought. And there wasn't really a guidebook, was there, especially for your first kid? You certainly had a lot of advice from people. You certainly knew that this was something that people had done before, your parents, your aunts or uncles. I mean, our life is full of people who are parenting and have been parents. And somehow you got through it. We weren't perfect, but by and large, our kids turned out okay. So too, I'd like you to take that courage and that excitement and that joy, even though you didn't know what the next day was necessarily going to bring, and apply it now to your life planning in life phase 9. So I encourage you to think through very conscious decisions to guide you and your family on this path, this developmental path in your life, and how to bring trusted people into your life and communicate with them about what it is that you would like in terms of treatment, and to make sure that they're there to support you when you're needed. So let's very specifically now talk about what are those documents that I keep referring to. And one of the things that I think is important, that I'm hoping that I bring to the table with this presentation, is that these are not just documents that your healthcare provider or an administrator at a facility or the nurse when you're getting into hospice says, here, sign these forms. But that I hope this is a much more thoughtful process about how you communicate and who you designate to help you through this phase. I really don't like comparing life phase 9 to childhood or being treated like a child. I really think that is just doesn't respect the dignity of all the lessons and all the experiences of your life. But I will make this parallel that children don't go through to adulthood on their own. They have a lot of support and guidance. And actually, as young adults, we have a lot of support and guidance from older friends and from our parents and our extended families. And as I mentioned, with parenthood, you always have the advice of your parents, your aunties, your sisters, people who have experienced it or are experiencing it with you. So too, I'd like to encourage you to think about the ninth phase of your life, the life where you're really gathering your wisdom. You know what you like. There's a lot of things that, frankly, you don't need to be bothered with anymore because you've experienced it already. And so that you are focusing on the essential, the core essential part of what's important to you in your life right now and what's important to you in your life as you're looking forward to the next few years with disability, with infirmity, but with a lot of wonderful memories about your life and your life experiences, and always the opportunity for creative expression at every point in your life. So, as I was saying, these are not a series of documents that are like check off the box. Even though if you go into the emergency room, what they're going to say is, do you have a healthcare decision? Have you completed the healthcare directives? So let me go step back now and say, what are these documents and how do they provide meaning as part of a discussion with yourself, of course, but also with the trusted people who are going to assist you on this. So they include a will, which comes into effect after you pass away, which helps to designate who would receive certain items as part of your estate. So will directs property after you pass. There's also a document called a financial power of attorney. This is a document that is in effect during your life, not after you pass. A financial power of attorney is for you to designate a very trusted person. It could be your spouse, but if your spouse is predeceased you, or if your spouse is living with dementia, you may not want to designate your spouse as your primary person to help assist you. So you may begin to think about who else in my life do I trust and is kind of close to me, where I would be comfortable sharing financial information and having them help me or assist me in making financial decisions. So it's really important to think through who that could be, how practical it is, how well you communicate with them, and whether or not they would be willing to take on this responsibility. A financial power of attorney document, you can designate more than one person, and generally people designate a person and a backup person. And they can set the terms or the time when this financial power of attorney document, this grant of authority to provide assistance with financial things in your life, and we'll talk about that in a second, to have them help you. So you can say when it becomes effective. The benefit of signing a financial power of attorney and thinking through those designations is if you were to experience certain declines, or you were even away for a while, or you were taking care of the person in your life that's living with dementia, it prevents what could be a catastrophe, which is a finding of incompetency by a court and taking away all of your rights, including your financial rights. So again, I'm just going to say this again, the value or the importance of signing a power of attorney and thinking through who you would designate to provide assistance in financial decision making is so that it prevents somebody coming in, like a bank or somebody coming in and seeking a guardianship where the court would take away all of your decision-making authority and place it in a third party. And so it's much better to plan ahead and think about who it would be than it is to really have such a drastic step as a guardianship. I mean, guardianships can serve a purpose, and I understand why it's important to be able to have in the law a process to assist people who need to have a guardianship. But as part of our thoughtful planning, even with the knowledge of a diagnosis like dementia, um, it's important to be able to do this planning. And I've found that as hard as it is to sit down and think through this sort of planning, that it provides great peace of mind because it can help you deal more directly with some of the emotional and physical issues of the end of our life. And it takes away some of that burden about what's going to happen to me. And it takes away some of that fear. So we've talked a little bit about a financial power of attorney, but I haven't talked about what it does. So a financial power of attorney can be broad and it can be narrow. You can grant to your agent the ability for the agent to pay your bills, take care of your investments, take care of your banking. You can even designate your agent to run your business for you. There's so you can have a very, very broad scope of authority that you delegate to your agent. You can also choose to have a very narrow scope of authority granted to your agent. You could say, you know, I want my agent to be able to help me pay my bills and to help engage. In other words, help me to hire people that I might need in my home. But you know what? I am not going to give them the authority to sell my home. I mean, that's just an example. And so that's why I'm saying this is not sort of a check off the box kind of document. This is a really expressive document that protects your financial decision making as long as you can, because again, it takes away hopefully the threat of a guardianship. But it also protects you in the sense that you can say, I'm comfortable with this person doing this, but I'm not comfortable with this other grant of authority. So I want to keep it narrow. And the nice thing about these documents is you can revise them and update that. And I think as we age and as we experience more and more of our life, that it's, you know, I usually recommend that people update their documents like once every 3 years. But I think because things change a lot in our lives, people come, you know, we're at the age where a lot of our friends passed before us, that people we may have designated, um, that it's really smart to look at this every year and update it on a yearly basis. Um, what's another? So that's a document. The financial power of attorney is a document for you to have somebody named that would help you with financial transactions and financial decision making. What's another really important tool, another important document when you think about how to communicate your life plans for your care? Well, it's for healthcare decision making. And New Mexico has had for many years a very progressive healthcare directive that allows a person to designate who would make medical choices for them when they were unable to communicate their wishes and what those choices are. So it does two important things. It says who would decide and communicate on your behalf, and what can they decide? In other words, what would they be communicating? And this is again a very flexible document that we can add to it based on a condition that you might be experiencing, based on um, a diagnosis, basing a diagnosis of dementia, if you've received that, to be able to think through at different phases of your life or what you anticipate to be different phases of your dementia experience, how at those different phases you would like to receive care. And again, who would be providing that care and making and communicating those decisions on your behalf. Um, there's a lot that can be done in that document, even if it's, and you can say it in a positive way and a negative way. In other words, you can say, these are the types of treatments I would consent to, but these are the sorts of things that I choose not to have for treatment. And again, these documents, I think sometimes it's better to be more thoughtful in thinking through it, and not just saying check off the box and let your agent, just let the agent decide, just let them do whatever they think is best. Because without having a clear conversation and kind of an ongoing conversation with the person that you've named to make decisions with you, and I really think that I like to say it as they communicate on your behalf. They don't substitute their judgment. They do the best they can to communicate what it is that your choices are. So, in order for them to be able to do that, they need to know what your choices are. And it can be a burden for them. It can be very hard for a spouse to be an agent because, if they are following through on some of your end of life choices, it means that they're going to be losing their beloved spouse. And so it can be very difficult, for a person really to be in that position where they're making those sorts of decisions on your behalf. So that's why having the communication about, these are my choices for treatment, these are things I would like, these are things I would not like. In many times, it helps kind of alleviate some of the guilt or the burden that the agent or the decision maker may be communicating on your behalf. Let me give you a couple of examples. So I was named as my parents had named me as my father's healthcare decision maker. And it's a big task, and I did it with joy and I did it with love, but that doesn't mean that it wasn't difficult at times. And so, as I had said, my father had vascular dementia. So many times he had series of strokes. And so we never knew if he was going to have a big stroke or they were going to continue to be small strokes, and kind of what some of his expectations for treatment or non-treatment would be. And I had some very heart to heart conversations with my father about what he felt his quality of life would be if he had experienced varying degrees of disability from a stroke. For example, I said to my dad, if you had a stroke and you were unable to walk as a result of the stroke, because he had already had some strokes where he did have trouble walking, but with a lot of rehab, he was able to regain his ability to walk. So he was like, yeah, if I have a stroke and I can't walk, I'm okay with that. I would certainly want to have PT and try to be rehabilitated because I've already done that once. So I'm fine. And so then I said, I said to my dad, so if you had had a stroke and you were on life support and they said, you know, your father would not be able to speak. He would regain consciousness, but probably would not be able to speak and wouldn't really be able to move. And I asked my dad, I said, if that were your condition, would you want to be to do that? He said, absolutely. He goes, if I had a stroke and I couldn't speak, but I could still see outdoors, and as the way he described it, I could see the leaves moving in the wind and I could see the trees outside and the birds in the trees. I feel I would have a life that was worth living, and so on. So, I mean, having those kinds of heartfelt conversations with my dad, I was actually always surprised by the frankness and the openness with which he was willing to engage in a conversation with me, even though it was about his disability. And it gave me much more confidence in thinking if I had to make these decisions and communicate them on behalf of my father, I had more confidence that I was doing what it was that he wanted and that I was honoring his life choices. So, part of what I think is important when we put together these documents, when I help people do it, is to bring in the agents that they have designated and have, for me to be able to facilitate this type of a conversation because it ends up being very affirming, but it's very scary to initiate these. And many times it's not as scary for the person putting together the documents, but it's sometimes very scary for the agent who's being appointed because they don't want to think about it. They're like, "Oh, you're going to be just fine." Whereas, so I think being able to engage in those sorts of conversations is important. I also think those conversations are not the kind of thing you just sit down and have, for 2 hours and then, you're done with it. I think it's an evolving process. And I know many people have read Dr. Wande's book, Being Mortal, but he lays out a very, very thoughtful kind of process for making decisions at different points along the way in the medical process and what's important to us at any given stage in our life and what kind of a diagnosis or treatment option are we facing. Each one of those times can be a chance for conversation and having a touchstone. It does not mean you have to redo your documents. It's not that. I'm not suggesting that, but I am suggesting, again, the documents are there to support you. Your documents are there to ensure you're treated with dignity. The documents are there to say, this is how I choose to live my life moving forward. And so engaging in that conversation, with support is a really wonderful gift, not only to yourself, but to the people who love you, who are on this path with you. So we've kind of touched base on this a little bit, but I want to talk to you very specifically. How do you think about putting together your life plan, life phase 9, if you're living with dementia or you are recently diagnosed with dementia? What kinds of things would I do differently if I were seeing you in my office and providing you with some advice? I certainly think that with a diagnosis of dementia, or if you're already living with dementia, the notion of having somebody who is very trustworthy to help you with your financial, um, just your financial life, paying your bills, engaging and hiring people, thinking through your financial plan, because when I say financial planning, I don't just mean your investments, but thinking through where are my assets, where are my resources, what are my medical needs, what are my housing needs, and helping to think through kind of mapping out the financial plan that is going to support your choices moving forward and making sure that you are able to receive the care that supports your dignity. So the financial planning, for example, you may desire to set up a financial power of attorney and immediately designate, transfer the authority to your agent and not wait for your 80th birthday or not wait um, for a more of a cognitive decline. The reason why it's an important consideration to think through that is because and a lot of people do this and it's okay, it's their choice, but sometimes I think it's because they just are checking off the box and they haven't really been counseled adequately about what is the meaning. Many times people put together the financial power of attorney and they say that the agent can exercise power on my behalf when I become incompetent. Well, how are you going to figure out if you are incompetent? You have to have a determination of competency. And if you are found by by medical providers, or if you're found by the court to be incompetent, then guess what? The court has an obligation to name a guardian. So by not really thinking through carefully the designation on the power of attorney and when it becomes effective, you can sort of slip into having been declared incompetent, which is exactly what we're trying to avoid. Instead, what's sometimes a better option is to have the agent have the authority immediately upon signing the document, because they're there not to substitute their judgment, not to take over financial planning, but to support your decisions and sort of what you've typically done throughout your life in terms of paying your bills, in terms of um, taking care of your home and having people come in, to clean your house or whatever it is. Or maybe at this point, sell your car. Maybe it's time for that. So again, they're there to support your decisions. They're there to provide another perspective. They're there to help provide some guidance. And so by sort of having that sort of seamless involvement earlier on, it many times prevents the designation of incompetency and what that means to you and your family to have a third party guardian all of a sudden overseeing your financial life and possibly your physical, your personal placement, and whether or not you can continue to make your own choices. So that's something that's important. And then the second thing that if again you come to me and you say I have a diagnosis, uh, I have a diagnosis of dementia, or I'm currently living with dementia, I would be very thoughtful about your healthcare power of attorney and your healthcare directive. There's lots of good support in thinking through how to think through medical decision making. And so I suggest that people look at the Five Wishes document. They have a very specific recommendations about what kind of care you would receive when and how you would receive it, down to whether or not how you'd want to be fed. Whether, I mean, it can be so, like what kind of music you like to listen to, and including all those sorts of things. I also know that the group Compassion and Choices has a really thoughtful recommendation about care decisions for people who are living with dementia. And they have a wonderful process. It's vetted by many professionals, and it includes some very specific choices about, again, feeding, care, bathing, and your physical environment. I like the Compassion and Choices recommendations because sometimes when things are too specific, it becomes very hard to actually implement. Um, but I like the level of specificity because it provides clear guidance in the Compassion and Choices recommendations. And again, I have these resources. If you give me a call or send me an email, I will make sure that you can have access to these documents, because I mean they're free, they're publicly available. And so it'll save you the time of trying to find it. The last document that I want to talk about in our time together is what New Mexico calls the MOST form. MO. It's the document that is signed by you and by your physician. So it's very different from the healthcare directive. The healthcare directive is signed by you and it says, this is what I want, and this is who I want to make sure communicates on my behalf. The MOST form is a standing medical order. That's why it's signed by your physician. And it's an order directing emergency medical professionals, EMTs, generally speaking, about what kind of care you want to receive at the end of your life or at any stage in your life. And so once again, if you have a medical emergency, believe me, the EMTs are not going to sit there and read your healthcare directive. I mean, they're not going to do that. And you don't want them to. They're there to get you stabilized so that they can transport you to the hospital. And so for them, time is of the essence. And not only that, I mean, they're very thoughtful medical providers, EMTs are, and they have a job, they have a duty to stabilize you and get you to the hospital so that you can get the care that you need. So the most form is an order to the EMTs from the physician saying, this is the care that you need to provide in an emergency situation, and this is the care that you don't have to provide. For example, and this is just a really common example, um, if you were to collapse at home, let's say you called the EMTs, um, do you want chest compressions? So, you can talk about what does that mean with your healthcare provider. I mean, that's not really a legal decision that I'm competent to give advice on because I'm not a physician. But that's an example. But you know what? In this most form, it might be worthwhile to include a statement, I am living with dementia. So please communicate with me in this way. So it's a very, I mean, it's a way of assuring that the EMTs in an emergency situation can deal with your whole situation and not just the the physical emergency that they are addressing at that minute, because being able to communicate with somebody living with dementia in an emergency is, as we all know, can be quite complicated. And so sometimes we need to be the emissary in working with our EMTs so that they can provide the calmest and the best care for you in that emergency situation. So we've had a wonderful time together. It's really been my pleasure to talk to you about living life to the fullest and thinking about preparing documents that support our decisions and that support what our choices are so that we can live our lives with integrity and with dignity. We talked about this part of our life, thinking about all the wisdom we've gained that we're bringing to the table at this important phase of our life. We talked about life planning documents, including our wills, but importantly, thinking about what are the documents that are going to be used while we're still alive: a financial power of attorney, a healthcare directive, and the most form. And then we specifically talked about how these forms can be used by somebody living with dementia and how to include that person's caregivers as part of their plan. So I wish so much we could have all been together face to face for this. I do, as I say, I miss seeing your lovely faces and getting that kind of feedback. But I just want you to know I'm here in Santa Fe. You can certainly call me and talk to others. But it's important to know for all of us that there is a community of loving, caring professionals who can provide support because while we don't know your specific situation, we have gone through the dementia journey with loved ones and with our community. So, with that, I'm going to sign off, but I really wanted to thank you, and I hope you just so enjoy this conference. And again, my thanks to Yuta and the entire planning team for all of their creative efforts in putting together this conference. Thank you.